The feast is o'er. Now brimming wine in lordly cup is seen to shine before each eager guest. And silence fills the crowded hall, as deep as when the herald's call thrills in the loyal breast.
Welcome back to the Weird Medieval Guys podcast. I'm Olivia, and this is Aran, a Norman.
Bonjour. And that's the one bit of whimsy you're getting from me today.
That's right. Today's episode is going to be a little bit of a bummer, because we're talking all about, that's right, the Battle of Hastings and surrounding events.
Yes. So, I think, look, we're on episode 5 of a 6-episode series. I think we can jump right into it in media res, but I think it's worth, because we've been doing this for about 85 years of releasing these episodes, it's worth doing a quick recap of the plot so far and the characters that you're going to have to keep an eye on the board over the rest of this episode.
Well done to everyone who's made it this far. It's been a bit of a long haul. You probably have several more gray hairs than you did when we started. You're probably older and wiser.
You have some children that you didn't have previously.
Exactly. I'm so sorry about the divorce. Your new girlfriend looks great.
Huzzah!
Huzzah! And so thanks to everyone who's stuck with us. This has been the longest series by far that we have done, and we've really enjoyed it.
It's going to keep getting longer. Let's start with our 3 protagonists who we've already met so far in this series. So, Harald Godwinson, at the start of 1066, is the Earl of Wessex and probably the most powerful man in England because the very old, very sick king, Edward the Confessor, is a bit of a cipher and always has been. He then dies in January, and Harald Godwinson is elected King of England. Now, Harald Godwinson has a brother called Tostig, who was chased out of his earldom in Northumbria the previous year, and seems to have sworn some kind of revenge against Harold and England, seemingly England as a whole, because he has been casting around continental Europe for allies, and by summer 1066 has formed a scheme to take the English throne with another of our protagonists, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. Harold's slightly tenuous claim to the throne of England is that he inherits a claim from his half-brother Magnus, who claimed, quite spuriously, that a previous Viking king of England named Magnus as the heir to the crowns of Norway, Denmark, and England. Last on our list of protagonists is William, the Duke of Normandy. He has had a pretty terrible life up to this point, surrounded by assassinations and murders and constant warring with the other various power brokers in the borderline anarchy of 11th century French politics, but he claims that he was promised the throne of England by Edward the Confessor in a secret meeting, and that Harald Godwinson has already sworn to uphold his claim to the English throne. There are also a couple of other hangers-on who we just need to keep an eye on in this story, so I'm just going to run through them very quickly. We have Edwin and Morcar, who are the 2 brothers who are the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia. They are not related to Harald Godwinson. They are kind of a third faction in English politics. We have Sweyn Estrithson, who's the King of Denmark, who essentially kicked Harald Hardrada out of Denmark when Harald tried to assert his claim that I previously mentioned to the throne of Denmark. And lastly, we have Edgar Atheling, a teenager from Hungary whose father was the exiled son of Prince Edmund Ironside, who was kicked out of England by yet another previous Viking king, and was brought back in the 1050s by Edward the Confessor to serve as a prospective heir. Anybody else? Is that about it?
I think that's about it. We'll, other people will be introduced and reminded of at your leisure, but I think those are the main ones, and as well the main 3 threads of power that you'll need to follow.
where we left you in the previous episode, Edward the Confessor has died in January 1066. Harald Godwinson has gotten himself elected King of England. And William, the bastard Duke of Normandy, is spitting mad. And on both sides of the English Channel, there is full expectation that this is going to have to be resolved with violence.
Across the pond in Norway.
And absolutely nobody is thinking about Norway.
Nobody's thinking about Norway, but Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the new king-to-be, has managed to convince Harald Hardrada that they should go and take England by storm. He's basically said, I've got mates over there, we've got mates over here, there's mates in Orkney, let's go round them up, and we can, between all of us, we can probably have England. So,
Huzzah.
Huzzah.
But before we pick up the threads of that story, it is worth having a quick word about how we know about the events of 1066, who is writing about it, and how reliable they might be.
So, as previously, one of our sources that we're going to use is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I won't get into this too much because we have talked about it before. It's an Anglo-Saxon source, as the name would imply. It's a manuscript that was actually compiled about 70 years before the events that we're discussing, but will continue to be updated after the fact. Sometimes multiple copies are updated out of sync with each other, so that will give us also some information about how different parties were looking at these events. But we know that even though the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle becomes more accurate towards this end of the area of time that it covers, it's very inaccurate for early English history, and it is a good source for sort of basic dates and facts later on, but it doesn't go into much detail, and of course there is that bias towards the English side. Now, another source that is going to be quite useful for the Viking side is the Heimskringla. So this is a collection of sagas that were written down in Iceland after the fact, about, I think, 100 years after the events that are taking place. This one has been attributed to Snorri Sturluson, who was someone to whom we can sort of ascribe specific biases and intentions, but it's actually not confirmed that he was the one that wrote this down. And the reason why that's important is because Snorri had beef with the Norwegians, and so knowing how he perceives Norwegians would give us some information about how he is portraying the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. But this is a pretty detailed source, and it is, although a lot of the actual dialogue and things that are said sort of verbatim that the people in this story will say in the Heimskringla are not going to be considered to be completely accurate.
Well, some of it, some very specific lines are repeated in other sources from other, from French or English sources.
Definitely, but it's told as a story, yes. And that's very useful for seeing how these events were turned into a story, but that does mean that there's some editorializing that's gone on.
Yes.
So again, grain of salt. You're probably noticing a common theme with some of these sources. Mm-hmm. And we've got another source who is Orderic Vitalis. So he is an English-born chronicler. He's not born until about 10 years after the events of 1066. But he's a very interesting guy because he's got a Norman father and an English mother. And we know this because he self-identified as Orderic Angligene, and so that means English-born. And he identifies himself as such after he is sent to Normandy to an abbey. So he's a monk. So he's sent to Normandy to an abbey, Saint-Evroul, to write a history of that abbey, which he starts in about 1110 AD, and eventually he spends so much time working on this project that it spirals into a full-blown Norman history, which, relatable for those of us
many people who did PhDs or master's theses understand this issue.
Yeah, and Orderic is actually one of the sources who's regarded as the most reliable of all of the ones that we can look at, because he has a very balanced point of view, and we can point to specific times where, unlike other Norman sources, he is trying to be sympathetic to the English side. I mean, just the fact that he identifies himself as Orderic Angligena, because he's an English guy, he moves to Normandy, and they actually start calling him Vitalis in Normandy because the French-speaking monks are saying, oh, Orderic is like an English name, we can't pronounce it. Your new name is Vitalis. So then he actually appends Angligena to his name so as to not have his English identity be erased.
Interesting.
And that's got to be, I think, quite a bold statement in Normandy directly after the conquest, to be very deliberately identifying yourself as English.
Yeah, and I also think that we can one of the ways we can tell where his sympathies lie is that he's obviously writing a secondhand source. He's drawing on a lot of primarily Norman histories. And there are important points at which you can look at the sources that he's drawing from and the points where his account diverges. And every point where his account diverges, pretty much, he is more sympathetic to the English narrative than the sources that he's citing.
Yes. So he's also, before he's moved to Normandy, he has an English education. Apparently he doesn't speak any French when he moves to Normandy as well. And a lot of the sources that he draws on for this history that he's writing are actually sources from soldiers and people who pass through the abbey, because the abbey is an important crossroads for travelers and soldiers and scholars who are, going around Europe. So we also know that he's getting a lot of information not just from the literary tradition, but actually from first-hand accounts of people, accounts from people who maybe weren't, at these events themselves, but might have some interesting information to share. So next I want to talk about, this is one of my favorite sources actually, because I love me some women's history, and this is the Vita Edwardi Regis. So this is a biography of King Edward, and it's written probably sometime after he's died. We don't know who the author was. We know they were probably Flemish, and we know that this work was almost certainly commissioned by Edward's wife, Edith of Wessex, who is also Harold Godwinson's sister.
Who has been treated very poorly in the narrative up to this point, but who seems to have been a genuinely just pretty normal, nice person.
Yeah, I think she's quite savvy, because she manages to navigate both, her Norman obligations sort of via Edward, or her obligations via Edward, as well as her obligations to her birth family. And so this book is split into two halves. So the first half is actually a pretty straightforward biography. It doesn't really seem to be very sensationalist. And the second half, which was probably written and definitely revised at a later date, is an extremely hagiographic biography of Edward as a saint. So Edward was canonized in 1161, under slightly dubious circumstances, but this is what's going to kind of go through and paint him as this really holy, really pious guy who couldn't even bear to have sex with a woman because he was so pious. And what's really interesting is that the first part of the book, the non-sort of saint part, is very sympathetic to almost everyone on the English side of the narrative. So to Tostig, to Harold, to Edward, to Godwin as well. So this book paints Godwin as being the father of the English people. And
not just a big rat.
Yes, it really stresses Godwin and Harold as being people who the English, loved and embraced sort of as leaders. And it paints the falling out between Tostig and Harold as this deeply tragic misunderstanding between brothers, rather than being something that's motivated by, spite or hatred, or greed. And so this really further solidifies the theory that Emma commissioned it, because it is written with this tone of what a shame that this family is falling apart. It's also quite critical of some of Edward's choices, however, including some of his choices to strengthen his relationships with Normandy. And it's quite critical of this one Norman bishop, I believe, that Edward appointed. And it ends with Tostig's exile and Edward's death, but it makes no reference, this first half of the book, to Tostig allying himself with Harald Hardrada, nor to specific distinct threats from Normandy. So one of the prevailing theories about when this book was written is that it was actually written before the Battle of Hastings, but after Edward's death, so in the first half of 1066. And that also makes it, I think, potentially a quite unbiased source compared to many of our other sources, because it's written, with Edith having the freedom to criticize Edward's choices that are endangering her family interests, because Harold and Tostig don't want more Normans being brought over. But it's also written before the Conquest and before the Battle of Hastings, so she also has the freedom to endorse Edward and Godwin and her brothers as, people who she looks up to and respects, without having to justify the Norman conquest. So it's also quite an interesting source for those reasons. And the last one is the Big Daddy, the Bayeux Tapestry, which is actually coming to England.
It is
next year.
Very excited. I think it's next year. I'm very excited.
Year. I know.
I swear, if they just keep it in the British Museum and don't tour it around or whatever, that'll be such a crying shame.
I'm sure they're just keeping it in the British Museum.
Put it in Hastings.
You can go to Reading and see a replica of it anyways.
I can go to Norwich Castle and see a Norwich-themed replica of it, which is more interesting.
That's true, you can. Shout out Norwich Castle.
We were walking around trying to figure out, is this a replica of the Bayeux Tapestry? And there was Norwich keeps coming up. I didn't know Norwich had such a major role in the Norman Conquest.
Yeah, and so the last source is, as we said, the Bayeux Tapestry. So this is, purists will say, oh, it's not a tapestry. Shut up. I don't care. It's embroidered. Whatever. The main thing is, it's a big piece of fabric, and it's basically, several dozens of meters of storytelling embroidered onto fabric, and it tells the story of the Norman Conquest. This was made by the Normans, probably in Normandy, probably somewhat soon after the Conquest. There's obviously a few different issues with this source. One is that it's a piece of fabric. There's not a lot of words on it. There are some words on it. There's not loads, and so there's.
Well, they're usually just Harold.
Yeah.
Regis.
Exactly.
Boat.
There's a lot of ambiguity there. So that's one issue, and of course the Norman bias is another issue.
What's a piece of court propaganda?
Well, we don't know who made it.
Oh,
we
come
don't
on.
know why it was made. No, we don't know who commissioned it.
No, but we don't know who commissioned it. But also, anybody who had enough money to commission a gigantic tapestry about the Norman Conquest is going to be... I'm not saying it's literally something that was necessarily made by William and his sort of inner circle, but it is... If you were a Norman and you had enough money to commission something like that, you were intimately involved in it. So I will defend that.
No, I'm going to push back on that. But anyways, we don't know. No one has signed it. No one has stamped it. No one has said, I made this for these reasons. And there are a lot of aspects of it that conflict with the Norman written accounts of the conquest. And so that's why I think we have to be careful about ascribing specific motivations to it.
Well, there's another reason that it's problematic, which is that it has been restored at various points.
That too.
And there is the possibility, in fact, I would say the probability, that various people who were restoring it took artistic license and decided to improve various aspects of the tapestry. There's one big one in particular that we will get to when we get to it.
And also the last part of it is simply missing. It's missing several meters. We don't know how much was missing, and we don't know what that part said. So we will never have a real ending to that story that it's trying to tell. And it's a particularly unique source because it also puts a very heavy emphasis on the time that Harold Godwinson spends in Normandy. And so it's very much, I think, if we can ascribe any motivations to it, it's very much trying to draw a connection between Harold's activities in Normandy and William's justification for the conquest. But there's not that many words on it, so we don't really know what the purported connection is.
Well, I think the reason for that is that the reason why it's brought up so much is pretty clear, which is that the Harold's visit to Normandy, which we talked about in the last episode, is central to the case that William will make for prosecuting the war in England, which is that Harold allegedly swore an oath on holy relics to to stand up for William's claim to the English throne. That is, as we will see, pretty important in certainly the retroactive justification for the war, and probably the justification for the war at the time. So, let's pick up in media res. So, pretty much immediately after after Edward the Confessor dies on the 5th of January, Harald Godwinson gets himself elected king and then crowned as king in London. And this is already highly unusual.
Red flags.
Because the English, there are different ways of understanding what a coronation is, what it does in the constitutional role of the monarchy in medieval England. So to use a comparison, right? When Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, Charles III became king of the UK immediately upon her death, right? He was not then crowned for another, I think, 6 to 8 months. I think it was May or something. It was crazy.
May, yeah, it was September to May.
Yeah, but constitutionally, he was still, his status did not change.
Yes.
It was the coronation reified the existing kind of power structures, and this is basically what the English tradition was. So you were under the English or the Anglo-Saxon tradition, you were king as soon as you were elected.
In fact, usually you were king as soon as the previous king died, because the matter of choosing the next king would be settled between the old king and the Wittengamot.
Yes, and as we talked about, I think in the first episode, the election of the king by the Wittengamot, the Assembly of Wise Men, how much of that was a meaningful election is a huge open question. I think the fact that the same family got elected as king for 100 years straight answers it pretty satisfactorily for me.
It was more of an emergency handbrake, maybe, than,
Yes. Well, I mean, it's not like it... Well, now we're just retreading old ground, but it's not like when Ethelred the Unready dies, they elect somebody totally out of left field. They elect Canute.
Yeah. And interestingly, for instance, when we look at other Anglo-Saxon kings as well, we notice that there's a pretty large period of time between when the previous king dies and when the new king is crowned formally. So with Ethelred, it was about a year. Yeah. And scholars have said, oh, that's actually normal. That was normal then. You know, if you look at other times of succession in Anglo-Saxon England, it's usually not that long, but it's usually 2 to 3 months, I would say, on average, in times of relatively peaceful succession, you know, not disregarding, oh, we need to go bring a guy from Scandinavia because we don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And
with Edward, it was the better part of a year as well.
Yeah, exactly. But even times when they were, in the same place, and it was not really a contentious matter, it was still customary to wait a couple months. You would have the old king's funeral, and you would take time to organize a coronation, make plans, because this would be a massive public display of power. Mm-hmm. And the whole point was sort of the public spectacle of it. And so the fact that Harold was crowned the next day, day after Edward died, I mean, some people have said, oh, this was actually just something that he did out of convenience, because actually it was early January and all of the nobles and the important people were all gathered in Westminster Abbey in London already for, the Christmas period of festivities. Specifically the Feast of Epiphany is on January 6th. They would have been congregating then. So there have been people who've said, it was probably just really convenient to do it literally the next day.
Horseshit. To which I would say,
I think it's complete BS.
I think that Harold would have done it in a broom closet in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
The day after, even if there was nobody else in London. And the reason for that is that the English tradition of, well, the coronation is a ceremonial thing. It doesn't really have it doesn't have a strong kind of constitutional purpose. That is not necessarily the trend everywhere. And one of the places where that is definitively not the case is Normandy. In Normandy, you're not really the duke until, and in France in general, I think, you're not really in office until you've had the ceremony.
Yes, and so the Bayeux Tapestry interestingly shows a scene in which Edward is on his deathbed and seems to be pointing at Harold Godwinson as if to say, all right, mate, you're up next. And so because there's no words, we don't know exactly what this was trying to say, but it also shows the coronation, and both the Bayeux Tapestry and the and other Norman sources deliberately frame the coronation itself as being a bit dubious. Mm-hmm. So, according to a lot of Norman written sources, Harold was crowned king by Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was extremely controversial.
Yes.
This was at the end of a very controversial career in which he had allegedly been excommunicated by 5 successive popes. And just remained in post. Apparently, Edward was like, I have bigger fish to fry.
That is a very Godwinson move. Of course, their Archbishop of Canterbury would be like this dude.
Yeah, and so the Bayeux Tapestry doesn't show Stigand actually crowning him, but it shows him there. And on the other hand, Anglo-Saxon sources sometimes say that Harold was crowned by the Bishop of York instead, who was legit, but a lot of the Anglo-Saxon sources actually don't mention who crowned him, which some people have taken as a little bit of a tacit admission that it may well have been Stigand who crowned him.
Which just adds to the general sense that there's something sketch about this.
Well, yes, and so either way, whether it's, you were crowned by someone who was not legally an archbishop who was excommunicated, or if it was just you had to have someone else who wasn't the Archbishop of Canterbury, the person who traditionally is, the only person in the kingdom with the power vested in them to crown a new king, so you had to get a different guy. Either way, the subtext is like something is not right about this coronation. It is not proper.
Yes. The reason why, reading between the lines, I think the reason why the coronation happened in that incredibly expedited way is that objectively, Harold knows that a conflict is coming with William. He knows that he needs to solidify his claim, and getting crowned, however you have to do that, is the best way to do that. The last thing that I think is important to note about the coronation is that there is another candidate. So we've mentioned him already, but the teenage Edgar Atheling, Prince Edgar, who is the distant grandnephew of Edward the Confessor, who grew up in Hungary and then returned. He is passed over by the great men of the kingdom. I think pretty much everybody would agree the reason why he is passed over, despite being dynastically the natural successor, is that everybody expects a war, and nobody wants to die for a boy king. As winter rolls into spring, an ill omen is sighted over the skies of England. And I'm going to read here from, I believe, Orderic Vitalis. There was all over England such a token seen as no man ever saw before. Some men said that it was the comet star, which others denominate as the long-haired star. It appeared first on the eve called Litania Major, that is, on the 8th before the calends of May, and so shone all the week. Now this has since been identified by astronomers as Halley's Comet. It was interpreted by people at the time as, and possibly retroactively because of what comes next, as a fantastically bad sign. You don't want strange lights in the sky in medieval Europe. It means bad things are going to happen, probably. Within days of the sighting of the comet, the first attack on England came. Meanwhile, in Normandy. So as we said in the last episode, when William hears about the coronation of Harold Godwinson, he is furious, and he immediately gathers the great men of Normandy to start preparing for a contest for the English throne. Now, Harold's coronation means that realistically, there's not really going to be a way for him to press a claim through any kind of constitutional settlement. It's not like he can show up to the Wittengemot and be like, please vote for me. Hysterical though that would have been. Realistically, I mean, yeah, compare his situation with Canute. Somebody who was able to become king despite having no kind of connection to the previous ruling dynasty, who was able to become king through constitutional mechanisms. That's not an option anymore. So the only option available to William is violence. And so he summons a council of the great men of Normandy, supposedly to advise him on what to do. So realistically, though, I think most people now argue that this is essentially him just getting the men of Normandy to sort of sign off on this and to essentially dip their hands in the blood.
Yeah.
Make everybody complicit. William of Poitiers, who's a Norman writer who Odoric Vitalis does draw on, claims that there were a lot of people in the court who were opposed to an invasion. And there's good reasons for them to think that. Because England, at this point, has a population of around 2 million, we think, probably. Normandy has maybe 500,000 people in it. Now, Normandy in the last decade has been able to kind of subjugate Brittany and Maine and a lot of of northern France, and so it has other reserves to draw on. But all the same, England also has a much larger navy and a much more sort of organized and bureaucratic military structure. And I would go out and say, actual head-to-head England v. Normandy on English territory is it's a big gamble. It's not undoable because, as we've talked about, the Normans are ferociously dangerous and have a lot of military successes and a lot of military experiences in France and in Italy and all over the continent as mercenaries. But it is still a big gamble. And so William sort of asks his barons to provide double their usual feudal obligations of funding and manpower for a military expedition. And the wheels of warfare in medieval Europe turn very slowly, especially in France, where everything has to be negotiated with these kind of local power players. And so each of the great barons of Normandy starts to muster their troops, and a navy of supposedly 696 ships is assembled to prepare for an invasion. And as I mentioned before, William also takes advantage of his military successes in the 1050s and 1060s, so he calls out troops from Flanders and Brittany as well, and he summons mercenaries from across France and even from the rest of the Christian kingdoms in Europe. Now, how big is this army? This is a really interesting question. Nobody knows. So medieval sources put it as anything from 70,000 to 150,000 men. This is psychotic. There's no chance it was that. Medieval historians love to exaggerate, and they love the number 100,000 as just a stand-in for lots.
Yeah, I mean, someone later on will go to say that the English forces number, I think, 1.2 million.
No. Which would be most of the country.
Yeah.
Including a non-significant number, or a not insignificant number of women and children.
Yes.
I think the Victorian authors, and I'm stealing this observation from Mark Morris here, but Victorian authors give us a much more conservative 7,000 men. But in any case, we know it's a big mobilization for what is essentially like an aquatic landing on a hostile country. And this army being gathered in Normandy would have been an enormous logistical feat. This would have required so much food being literally carted in, from across Normandy and across France. And this logistical feat and keeping this army fed and happy and coherent would have required... It's not sustainable. You need to strike fairly quick. You've got a window of a few months, basically.
Yeah, because you know what else they're bringing over? Several thousand horses.
Yes. Horses gotta eat.
Horses gotta eat. People gotta eat. Gotta have space for all of these people and horses.
Yes.
It's no small task, I'll tell you that.
And the other thing that William does is he starts engaging in a little bit of diplomacy. So he sends an embassy to Rome, to the Pope, to essentially make the case for an invasion. So we don't have the actual contemporary accounts of the conversation that the Norman ambassadors have with the papal officials, but according to later Norman sources, they claim that Harold... Well, they claim what we've already heard, which is that Harold swore on holy relics to defend William's claim to the throne and has since got himself crowned king and therefore isn't legitimate as a Christian king.
Yes, and I think also it's recorded that the matter is brought up that they don't have a very good handle on their own church and, for instance, have kept around this Archbishop of Canterbury who has been excommunicated a non-zero number of times. And so I think there's also probably some fear in Rome that England is, starting to stray.
Yes. And so as a result, Pope Alexander II blesses, according to later Norman sources, this is the other difficult thing, is the question of whether or not this actually happened. We don't even know that this necessarily happened, but according to later Norman sources, Pope Alexander blesses the invasion and gives the Normans to take with them his own papal banner. So they are doing this, they are prosecuting this war nominally in the Pope's name. Smash cut back to England, May 1066. In May, Tostig Godwinson, like Loki at Ragnarok, arrives at the head of a pirate fleet that's been provided by the Count Baldwin of Flanders. Now, Harold has to call up his naval levies in Wessex to essentially chase Tostig out, which Tostig does after very, very little resistance. And he flees north, raiding the coasts of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire. And apparently, tries to get in touch with his brother Gurth to join him, which Gurth is like, no. Listen, this is a family of problem children, and you're the problem child.
Yep.
And so Tostig essentially is then driven out of Northumbria by Earls Edwin and Morcar. And he flees north again, this time spending the summer as a guest of Malcolm III of Scotland. Now, I pause here. Those who remember episode 2 know that one of the reasons why Tostig was chased out of Northumbria is because he was absolutely unable to stop Malcolm invading.
Unable or unwilling?
Well, this is the thing, is why you might be... Those unfamiliar with Anglo-Scottish relations might be wondering, why would a Scottish king shelter an English exile who he's previously been at war with just to cause problems for England? And I would say you have a lot to learn about the Scottish psyche. Tostig, after spending the summer with Malcolm, sails west to Norway, possibly to Denmark first. There's some indications that he tries to make an alliance with Svein Estridsson first, but ultimately ending up in Norway at the court of Harald Hardrada, as we've talked about before, and that is where he convinces Harald Hardrada to make a play for England. But this is the important thing to note about this, is that Harold Godwinson doesn't know that he does this. This is really important for you to know. Harold Godwinson is absolutely focused on the war that he knows is coming with Normandy, and so he spends his time preparing his levies in Wessex and arranging a sort of wall of lookouts across the south coast to allow him to mobilize anywhere that Normandy choose to strike. And so it seems like England and Normandy are set to clash in the summer of 1066. But the problem is, the summer of 1066 is unusually stormy. And the English Channel is already... I don't know if anybody who listens to this has ever taken the ferry from England to France. It's not... It's seasickness central.
Well,
it's
get
tough.
properly thrown about.
Yeah. It's not easy. And trying to send an enormous, complicated navy over even what is quite a short distance on the English Channel is not going to be easy. It is better to wait. And so William waits, and Harold waits, and summer starts to stretch into September. And then, on the 18th of September, something happens that neither Harold Godwinson nor William the Bastard have figured in at all, which is that Harold Hardrada, the thunderbolt from the north, the captain of the Varangian Guard, the greatest warrior of the age, lands on the coast of Northumbria, south of York, with an enormous army of Vikings and English exiles led by Tostig, ready to take what is rightfully theirs.
Yes, so first they've gone to Shetland and to Orkney, which is a Viking earldom at that point in history, and so they've picked up friends along the way. And so the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles and the Heimskringla actually more or less agree on the size of the fleet. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I believe, says that it's 300 total ships. The Norse sagas say that it's 200 warships and many other smaller ships. So we are talking a good, again, hard to estimate numbers, but a good probably 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 men packed into these ships.
Piecing together what the Viking strategy is a little bit complicated. What we do know is that they seem to head north with York, which is the historic capital of Northumbria, in their sights, take York, and then sort of presumably fan out and take the north as a whole. They are met at the settlement of Fulford by an English army led by Morcar of Northumbria and his brother Edwin of Mercia, who have presumably shat themselves.
Yeah, this will come up again, but really at no point in these stories do these guys come across as guys you can really count on. And this will be the first place where they demonstrate that, because they fold pretty easily.
They just get swatted aside.
Yeah.
Pretty effortlessly. And so Harold and Tostig are able to march into York pretty much unopposed.
And so presumably they're like, oh, this is great. We're making so much progress already. And so they set up York as their kind of base, and they start demanding from the Northumbrians to be given supplies and military aid. And in exchange, all the Northumbrians will be safe, and under the new Viking regime, they'll be, much appreciated.
Well, remember that Northumbria is disproportionately Norse. This is something that we've not talked about in quite a few episodes, but there is a large Scandinavian and Scandinavian descended community in England, and that is concentrated disproportionately in the north of England.
Yes, exactly.
The reign of Canute is still in living memory, just about. There will be lots of people who'll be like, yeah, another Viking king, we can do that. You had the drift and chaos of Edward for 2 decades. Actually, a big, strong, decisive Viking showing up to sort things out probably was quite appealing.
Well, yeah, we don't know what the Northumbrians felt about that, and we never will know what they felt about that. So it all seems to be going pretty hunky-dory for this Viking fleet, because they know, Harold Hardrada and Tostig know, that Harold Godwinson is down south. He is preparing for a Norman invasion. He doesn't have time to deal with them, presumably, or at least he won't be able to do so very quickly, because they're hundreds of miles away. So they basically think that they have probably a good few weeks, a couple of weeks, to sort of rally the troops, so to speak, from Northumbria, get all of their shit together, and they'll be feeling great by the time that Harold Godwinson makes it up to Yorkshire to meet them. So Harold Godwinson finds out quite quickly about the presence of this army of invaders in his country, and he immediately begins to march north with his men. How he does this, I don't know.
No, because we've talked before about how even information can take weeks to get from London to Northumbria in this period.
Exactly. So he manages to muster what is believed to be an army of around 10 to 15,000 foot soldiers and possibly around 2,000 men on horses. And he makes it to Yorkshire in 4 days. So it's about 200 miles, at least, that he marches, which is absolutely insane. And so the Vikings have told the Northumbrians to send their men and their supplies to a place called Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent. And instead of being met by throngs of soldiers and supplies ready to come to their aid, the Vikings get there and they are met completely out of left field, completely blindsided by an enormous English army. And interestingly enough, in the Heimskringla, it also corroborates that they're completely blindsided. And it even says that Harald Hardrada sees the army and wonders, he asked Tostig, who do you think those guys are? Do you think they could be our friends? And Tostig, who maybe has told I get the feeling maybe he's told Harold, there probably are people who are allies of mine in England who will come to our aid.
Yeah.
Only to be, of course, sort of told off by Gurth and maybe some other allies. So Tostig, it's said in the sagas, sort of quite cautiously says, well, they could be allies.
Theoretically.
But I just don't know.
So, as Harold prepares his men for battle, which remember that they are totally unprepared for, but they're Vikings. They're just like, fuck it, huzzah! The King Harold saga claims that Harold composes the following poem. Advance, advance, no helmets glance, but blue swords play in our array. Advance, advance, no mail coats glance, but hearts are here that ne'er knew fear. Then said King Harald Sigurdsson, these verses are but ill composed, I must try to make better, and composed the following. In battle storm we seek no lee, with skulking head and bending knee, beneath the hollow shield, with eye and hand we fend the head. Courage and skill stand in the stead of panzer helm and shield in Hild's bloody field. And then there's an implied huzzah.
Huzzah!
I just love it because he's like, the build-up and punchline to this whole saga has been full of him spontaneously composing great poetry. And then he's like, you know what, actually, that wasn't my best work.
Scratch that.
But also, it is, some might say, it is Snorri or whoever suggesting that perhaps his glorious luck is running out. And indeed, that is the next lines very strongly suggest this. So, to quote again, King Harald Godwinson had come with an immense army of both cavalry and infantry. Now King Harald Sigurdsson rode around his array to see how every part of it was drawn up. He was upon a black horse, and the horse stumbled under him, so that the king fell off. He got up in haste and said, a fall is lucky for a traveller! Huzzah! The English King Harold said to the Northmen who were with him, do ye know the stout man who fell from his horse with the blue kirtle and the beautiful helmet? That is the king himself, said they. The English king said, a great man and of stately appearance, but I think his luck has left him.
It's funny, when we were putting together this episode, I said to Aaron, the first half should just be us reading verbatim from the Heimskringla, because it is so good.
It's just a cracking story.
Yes, and if you want to hear more quotes from it, well, you're in luck, because we have, in the prelude to this conflict, another account.
Yeah, it's just wall-to-wall bangers for, quite a few pages. So this describes the sort of the initial parley between the English and the Viking armies to try and see if there's some sort of negotiated settlement possible. 20 horsemen rode from the Thingmen's troops against the Northmen's array, and all of them, and likewise their horses, were clothed in armor. One of the horsemen said, is Earl Tostig in this army? The Earl answered,
it is not to be denied that you will find him here.
The horseman says, thy brother, King Harold, sends thee salutation, with the message that thou shalt have the whole of Northumberland, and rather than thou should not submit to him, he will give thee the third part of his kingdom to rule over along with himself.
This is something different from the enmity and scorn he offered last winter. And if this had been offered then, it would have saved many a man's life who is now dead, and it would have been better for the kingdom of England. But if I accept of this offer, what will he give King Harald Sigurdson for his trouble?
He has also spoken of this, and will give him 7 feet of English ground, or however much he needs, for he is taller than most men. So this is just to step out of the scene. This is one of the hardest lines in all of Western literature, and it's also one of the lines that is corroborated in other sources.
So sick, man.
It's so
fucking sick.
7 feet of English ground, for he is taller than most men.
Yep. Oh.
Anyway,
then
said the Earl,
go now and tell King Harold to get ready for battle. For never shall the Northmen say with truth that Earl Tostig left King Harald Sigurdsson to join his enemy's troops, came to fight west here in England. We shall rather all take the resolution to die with honour or to gain England by a victory.
Then the horsemen rode back. King Harald Sigurdsson said to the Earl, "Who was the man who spoke so well?" The Earl replied,
That was King Harald Godwinson. Gah!
Yes!
Banger! Tostig has ridden out and come face to face with his own brother on the fields with battle brewing, and rather than really directly acknowledge anything that's happened between them, they've just had this extremely sort of, I don't even know what to call it, this just extremely sort of formulaic sort of formal exchange.
It's very Tolkien-esque.
Just holding each other at arm's length. Because what do you say at that point, really?
Yeah. So, well, Harold has an offers
Well, then we go back to comic relief.
Yeah. Then said King Harald Sigurdsson, "That was by far too long concealed from me, for they had come so near to our army that this Harold should never have carried back the tidings of our men's slaughter." Meaning, why didn't you kill him, you idiot? If you said literally anything at any point, I would have had him killed right now.
Exactly.
What is this big theatrical parlay you want to do? Then said the Earl,
It was certainly imprudent for such chiefs, and it may be as you say. But I saw he was going to offer me peace and a great dominion, and that, on the other hand, I would be his murderer if I betrayed him. And I would rather he should be my murderer than I his, if one of two be to die.
Which is also so interesting.
It's incredibly, it's incredibly meaningful, because he's saying, despite everything that's happened, I don't want, I want to win things fair and square. I want to settle things fair and square. And I think it
well, also, I don't want to be my brother's murderer.
Yeah, I think it shows some lingering guilt, and
there's pathos there.
But yeah, so I mean, Tostig, I think, is feeling a little bit emo, but
yeah,
he knows what he has to do.
Obviously, again, this entire dialogue is certainly a poetic license on the part of the authors, but I think it's sending a very deliberate message, which is it's saying that Tostig, having taken things so far, is kind of having some degree of remorse. And even if he's not willing to change course, he knows that what is kind of about to unfold is on some level a tragedy.
There is another part where, upon realizing that the army is an enemy army, Harald Hardrada says to Tostig, "Okay, so what do we do now?" And Tostig says, "Well, we go back to the ships and call it a day." And Harald Hardrada is like, "No, really." And
absolutely not.
Tostig is like, "Obviously, we stand and fight."
Huzzah!
Huzzah! Huzzah!
I think this is the point at which he realizes, oh no, these people are mad.
Yep.
So, with diplomacy failed, the under-equipped and unarmored, in many cases, Viking army prepares to face down the English. The English and Viking armies array facing each other on opposite sides of the river and across the titular Stamford Bridge. And as the English try to kind of advance on the Vikings across the bridge, they are stopped by, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a single Viking warrior wielding an enormous two-handed Dane axe, who single-handedly hews down 40 English soldiers before he is unceremoniously stabbed from below by a couple of Englishmen who have rowed underneath to stab him with a big spear. The Heimskringla does sort of describe the battle in very poetic terms, and I mean that quite literally, because it quotes the skald Arnor, who has been a major source, has been cited throughout the saga, who gives us another banger, to be honest. Where battle storm was ringing, where arrow cloud was singing, Harold stood there, of armor bare, his deadly sword still swinging. The foeman feel its bite, his Norsemen rush to fight, danger to share with Harold there, where steel on steel was ringing. So Harold is in the middle, is apparently at the sort of spear tip of the Viking army, in the middle of the battle, but he is suddenly out of nowhere hit by an arrow in the throat and dies. And this utterly demoralizes the Norsemen. And Harold, somehow, according to the saga, Harold and Tostig agree a pause in the fighting for another round of negotiation. So I'm going to quote again from the Heimskringla. Before the battle began again, Harald Godwinson offered his brother, Earl Tostig, peace, and also quarter to the Northmen who were still alive. But the Northmen called out, all of them together, they would rather fall, one across the other, than accept quarter from the Englishmen. Then each side set up a war shout, and the battle began again. So says Arnor, the king's skald. The king, whose name would ill-doers scare, the gold-tipped arrow would not spare. Unhelmed, unpanzered, without shield, he fell among us on the field. The gallant men who saw him fall would take no quarter, one and all, resolved to die with their loved king around his corpse in a corpse ring. And this is, I do want to pause again here to just point out that this is, as we say goodbye to Harald Hardrada from this story, what a life. He went out historic on the Fury Road, as he always would have wanted to do, I think. Complete on a suicidally brave, mission. Unarmored, his army's completely unprepared, and he's just like, fuck it, let's be legends.
Yeah, after writing some banger verses.
And I think that there's a reason why Harald Hardrada's death, and also the symbolic death of this one Viking berserker on Stamford Bridge, is kind of treated by a lot of historians as the last moments of the Viking Age. Because Scandinavian society, as we've been talking about, has already been going through this dramatic transformation into this land of big Christian kingdoms and sort of, governments and, and more kind of recognizably modern institutions. And it's no longer this kind of the Wild West, basically. The settlements are getting bigger. They're building walls. On some level, it does feel a little bit like the world is enclosing and becoming kind of mapped and navigable. And that is very much not what the Vikings in history have been about.
No, I mean, they've mostly converted to Christianity and actually kind of mean it at this point. They've stopped, getting in big boats with other mates and going off on these grand adventures around the world. Varangian Guard is mostly people from the Rus, rather than these sort of exotic men from the furthest north reaches of Europe. And yeah, it's the transition from being this especially sort of pre-literate people who are singing each other's stories and telling each other these epic sagas, because saga literally means that which is said. It's the transition to being a much more self-conscious, inwardly focused people, and they begin to write down their histories and to begin to try to construct some kind of story and narrative and meaning out of everything that's happened up until then.
So the Viking army is routed, although, and most of them die, although Harold apparently does offer, essentially, quarter to Harold's son, to Harald Hardrada's son and a few others, and allows them to return to Norway.
Yeah, he doesn't chase them very far because
No.
I think he already has the sense that he's won the battle. His men are overexerted, and the stories of the aftermath of this battle are unbelievably brutal. Of the river just being filled up with corpses so that you don't even need to walk over the bridge anymore. People are just like running over piles of corpses. It's unbelievably brutal, so thousands of men on both sides have died. Of course, it's been catastrophic for the Vikings, but also for the English. And Orderic Vitalis, so again, writing around 1110 AD or possibly later, so at least 45 years after this battle, says, "The field of battle may be easily discovered by travelers, as great heaps of the bones of the slain lie there to this day, memorials of the prodigious numbers which fell on both sides."
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some people suggest that Harold lost about a third of his troops, which, if true, is 5,000. Is like 3,000 to 5,000 men. Another person who definitely did die at the Battle of Stamford Bridge is Tostig Godwinson. His body is recovered, though, and he is apparently buried in York Cathedral, which I think speaks to there's some kind of, like, that's very respectful. That shows there is some kind of lingering, I don't know, affection might be a strong word, but sense that he deserves to be treated with respect despite sort of turning against his king and against his family.
Yeah.
But there's not much time for Harold to kind of to mourn the losses or like recover, because on the 29th of September, William's army makes landfall on the south coast of England. And Harold receives word of this very quickly and has to immediately begin another death march south to London to face down William once and for all. So, meanwhile, what has been happening in the south of England? Well, after landing in England, William's army begins pillaging the land around the south coast for two reasons. One, because this is an enormous army of 7,000 men and they are very hungry. You need to take stuff. And this is what you do in medieval warfare. You live off the land, of the land that you're conquering. There's another reason, though, that has been speculated by a lot of historians, which is that the pillaging is particularly violent because William is trying to draw out Harold. And this goes on for a couple of weeks, by which time Harald Godwinson is able to return to London and confer with the surviving members of his family about what they should do. And this apparently splits the Godwinson family, this is another really interesting psychological kind of nugget that we have. So apparently the Godwinsons have a massive argument amongst themselves about how to handle this. So Geitha, the matriarch of the family, having just lost a son, has absolutely no interest in losing another one needlessly, and she begs him not to go and confront William. Apparently Gurth offers to lead an army against William in Harold's name. And Harold apparently flies into a rage and storms off and decides that he is going to face the Normans. Now, as we move from the end of September into October, we do know that that Harold and William must have had correspondence, even though they didn't meet. Because we know that William offers to allow Harold to stay as the Earl of Wessex. And Harold gives the fantastic counteroffer of, how about this? How about you leave and pay me money for all the stuff that you destroyed, and I won't kill you. So that having achieved very little, the two prepare for battle and muster armies that face each other on the road near Hastings on the morning of October 14th.
And Harold has actually left some of his men up north, because he's left Morcar and Edwin with their men up north. And this is also, I think, a little bit unclear why he did this, but the two of them just seem to have established themselves as being extremely unreliable in these situations, and just completely sort of they're both guys who have had, possible designs on the throne. They're both guys who are a bit slimy and a bit untrustworthy. So,
well, their father was the great rival to Godwin at the court of Edward the Confessor even going back to the start of Edward the Confessor's reign. So there's a long-standing enmity. These are not guys who can be relied on. They have very much their own agenda. And also, they just got their clocks cleaned.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's not like they've covered themselves in glory in this story. Although we do know that at some point in October, they seem to have gone south again and gone to London. We don't know when. So, anyway, back to Hastings. So, we don't know how big each of these respective armies are.
Yes, so again, one guy who's a Norman, Guy of Amiens, says that there were 1,200,000 English soldiers. That's probably not true. It's probably much closer to 7,000 or 8,000. It's most of the estimates of the sizes of the English and the Norman forces overlap somewhat. One thing we can tell you for sure is that they had 100% infantry. No cavalry whatsoever. It just wasn't really a type of soldier that existed in Anglo-Saxon England. So, like earlier when we talked about horsemen going up north, those would have been men on horses who would not have ridden into battle with their horses. They would have dismounted at the scene of the battle and charged in on foot. And this is going to stand in stark contrast to the Normans, because what have they been developing over the past few decades or so?
They've been making knights.
Yes, exactly. And so we even have accounts saying that when English soldiers previously had to fight on horseback, they didn't do a very good job of it. So they haven't really been perfecting these skills, whereas the Normans have. And the English also don't have archers.
Well, okay, this is where I'm going to put my hand up.
They don't have many
archers. They probably
archers.
did have some archers.
They didn't have very many archers. It's hard to say. A handful.
Yeah.
A few dozen, I don't know. So you remember when we talked about how decisive those longbowmen were at, what was the battle?
I mean, pick a battle.
Oh, yeah. Pick a struggle. Yeah. Agincourt.
There was like 7 different battles in the 100 Years' War where those big bows are just plowing through the French.
And they've not got that, so, not many archers for the English. Meanwhile, the Norman forces were probably about 1/2 infantry and then about 1/4 archers and 1/4 cavalry. So again, all those horses they've been bringing over on their boats are going to serve them pretty well in this battle.
Yeah. The one advantage that the English do have is that they have occupied the high ground, and they form this enormous sort of impenetrable shield wall. And initially the Normans try to break it down by raining down a hail of arrows, but the English literally just absorb them with their shields, suffer very few casualties. And also, the fact that they have very few archers actually helps them in this, because one of the techniques, if you're doing an exchange of archery in a medieval battle, is that you can pick up your enemy's arrows. So but the English aren't firing any arrows at the Normans, so the Normans are starting to run low on arrows pretty quickly. So the shield wall isn't breaking, and the Normans send their heavy infantry and mounted knights in against the English. So ostensibly, before the English and Norman infantry meet, there is this very colorful moment in the battle.
Yeah, so this is something that we've spoken of after the battle. It probably didn't happen, but here's what probably didn't happen, is a Norman minstrel, who is the personal entertainer of William the Bastard himself, a guy named Taillefer, is said to have ridden out in front of the English shield wall, juggling swords and singing songs from the story of Roland.
And a song you might just recognize.
Kings of Roland, there is his gallant who dies on the field.
So the Song of Roland in its, literary form doesn't exist yet at this point, but the story of Roland as the brave French warrior who gives it all on the battlefield for his people in a land far away from home is going to resonate with these Norman soldiers on the field.
Yes, and apparently this minstrel, one English soldier just decides, fucks this, breaks ranks and swings his sword at him, but the minstrel decapitates him immediately. Again, didn't happen, but very colorful.
Yes.
So the English, despite this, stay resolute for hours, repelling countless Norman charges. Again, they don't necessarily have the latest military technology of knights, etc., but if there's one thing the Anglo-Saxons know how to do, it's stand in one place and not fucking move. Which is incredible when they are facing down, again, the most sophisticated war machine in Western continental Europe.
Well, it's like Sharp says in Sharp. All you have to do is fire 6 shots a minute and stand there. I know you can fire 6 shots a minute. Can you stand there?
Hell yeah. What
Except
a good
they don't
show.
have to fire 6 shots a minute. Love that show. Oh, maybe we should watch an episode of Sharp.
After this, yes.
Yeah.
So then, as the sun is starting to set, an opportunity presents itself. So part of the Norman, and there are different accounts of this story. I'm going to give you the sort of very simplified version that is broadly agreed upon. Part of the Norman army starts to flee, possibly because they've given up, possibly because there's some kind of ruse to trick the English into pursuing them. Some of the English army break ranks and starts to chase what they think is an enemy that they are starting to rout. William then rides towards these would-be deserters and rallies them, and they turn around and countercharge the English. And the fact that part of the English army has broken ranks, because the shield wall has to be locked in. You have to have guys standing as close as possible together so that the kind of the wall holds. If part of the army is exposed, it doesn't work. And that is indeed what happens. So as the Normans countercharge the sort of the exposed flank of the English army, Englishmen start getting slaughtered. And somewhere in this chaos, as English sort of morale starts to break, Harald Godwinson gets killed. And this is another area where we truly do not know what happened. So you're probably saying, what do you mean? The most famous part of the bio tapestry is the part that says that Harald Godwinson gets shot in the eye and dies from that wound. Except for the fact that we have good reasons to doubt that that is actually what happened to him. So the bio tapestry, first of all, that scene could be an addition by a later restorer, but even if it isn't, even if it is the original design, it's slightly too convenient.
Also, on the Bayeux Tapestry, there's a guy getting shot in the eyeball and a guy getting stabbed. Is 2 guys, and over them it says the death of King Harold. So it's not actually clear on the Bayeux Tapestry who is King Harold of those 2. But it's also overly convenient because in biblical and medieval literary tradition, stabbed through the eyeball is the appropriate punishment and way of execution for those who renege on their oaths.
Yeah, it's a reference. I think it's a reference to King Zedekiah. It's all it's too cute, basically.
It's an established literary trope at this point.
And also, it is so... It is also, there are 2 other reasons why I doubt this story. One, it is just slightly too much like what happens to Harald Sigurdson, or Harald Hardrada, which nobody seems to question. Secondly, getting hit by an arrow, a stray arrow in the middle of battle, does seem a bit like the hand of God. And so you could say the oath-breaking king dies in the most sort of narratively satisfying way through a completely random act of God is just too convenient.
Yes.
The other reason why I don't believe it is because the earliest textual source for the battle is the Carmen Widonis by Guy of Ames, which has a completely different story. Guy claims that William spied Harold fighting on the hill, gathered a band of knights who surrounded Harold and hacked him to death. Now, I admit, right, that this also appeals to me because for me, I find this more narratively satisfying. I find the idea that, because William is a bit of a bastard. And it is more narratively satisfying if the two guys kind of come face to face with each other before the end. So we can also kind of have a question mark about that version of the story as well. But I don't think I believe the arrow story.
No. But it has become very iconic.
Yes.
You can buy a little Christmas ornament of Harold getting shot in the eyeball. It's quite nice. It's like embroidered. It's metallic. I put it in my gift guide on my blog.
So with Harold dead, it turns into a proper rout, and large numbers of wounded men start fleeing north towards the relative safety of London. Those who are left dying on the road are slaughtered by the advancing Norman soldiers in a very bleak scene. And William of Poitiers, who again is very much a pro-Norman source, has a pretty grim description of sunrise the morning after the battle. Far and wide, the earth was covered with the flower of English nobility and youth, drenched in blood. And by the way, it's not just Harold who is dead. Gurth is dead, and I think the last of the Godwinson brothers is dead as well, Leofwine. So, an entire generation of the family has basically been wiped out.
Yep.
To a man, not to a woman.
Not to a woman.
Edith's still there.
And after the battle, apparently, Geitha, Harold's mother, begs William and the Norman troops to give her Harold's body, so she at least has something to bury, so she can at least see him one last time. And they refuse. And according to the histories, Harold's first wife, Moray Danico, #MorayDanico, bit of levity there, Edith Swanneck, whose name may not actually have been Swanneck. It may have been a corruption of Swanhneska, which would mean the gentle swan. So Edith, the gentle swan, Harold's possibly first wife, probably lover, walks through the field of battle alone, through the field of corpses, until she finds his body, until she recognizes him and can take him home to his mother to be buried in Waltham Abbey.
And in the aftermath of the battle, William consolidates his position by burning the towns of Romney and Dover, seemingly to make a point and also to kind of resupply his army, while waiting to see if London would surrender.
And he gathers up all of the bodies of the Normans and basically throws them together into a big mass grave. Well, he doesn't afford the same courtesy to the English who have died. He just leaves them there on the field to rot. So we've never actually found where this battle... We've never found this big grave. And, there's reason to believe we might not necessarily, on account of all of the looting and, history that's taken place, all of the layers and layers that have been built up and worn down and rotted out. But in sources, it's recorded as Sand Lake. And I actually read a theory that the reason why it's recorded in that way, or why that was the particular name, of all of the sort of surrounding towns, that was the one name the Normans picked up on, was because to them it sounded like Sanglak, which means lake of blood. And so that was how they enshrined the memory of this battle. It was the lake of blood.
What lovely, cuddly people. let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what's happening in London at this point. So the city is absolutely swelled with people, both survivors from the Battle of Hastings and also troops who arrived too late to join. We also have within the city Edwin and Morcar, who came down again at some point, presumably in October, and Edgar Atheling, the sort of the boy prince, and this aforementioned Archbishop Strigond. And so, with the Normans advancing, this kind of absolutely bootlegged version of the Wittengemot meets again and decides not to support William, but to elect Edgar as the king. So William sends ambassadors to London to demand that the city submits, and he offers a place on William's royal court to the man who's been given the responsibility of defending the city of London, a man called Ansgar the Staller, who is the sheriff of Middlesex County, who is brutally wounded and is literally, according to some people, on a stretcher. Right? He's being stretchered around, and you can tell that he's like, this is an absolutely grizzled guy, because he's possibly on the verge of death, being offered like terms of peace, and he basically tells William to go fuck himself. And he, from his stretcher, he directs this desperate defense of London. The Norman army marches up to London and is met by the men of London, essentially, who mount this desperate defense of London Bridge and keeps the Norman army from being able to cross the River Thames and get anywhere near London. So, unable to access London, William orders his men to do what they were doing before Hastings, which is to start fully ravaging the countryside south of the Thames, just slaughtering people indiscriminately. Like, they were already looting. This is just kill as many people as possible, cause as much damage as possible, drive a surrender. So they rampage west to Wallingford, which is quite a few miles west of London, and where they are able to ford the Thames and begin heading east again to encircle the city. Meanwhile, Edwin and Morcar, despite having pledged to support the claim of Edgar Atheling, leave.
Yeah, they've got their own ideas.
Yes. And so, suddenly, the city of London is left with the prospect of fighting a hopeless battle against a brutal enemy in the name of a child. And you can imagine for those weeks how desperate that situation would have been, as people would have received word of, well, they burned down another village. You know, they killed another 1,000 people. And so, a few weeks later, London surrenders. So after London surrenders, Edgar Atheling and Bishop Strigond and the various sort of dregs of the Anglo-Saxon High Command head west to Berkhamsted, where they all collectively submit to England, submit to William, and recognize him as the new king. So, a few weeks later, William of Normandy enters the city of London, and on Christmas Day, 1066, William of Normandy, William the Bastard, is crowned William the First of England. So William's reign does not start happily for the common people of England. Orderic Vitalis sums it up very well. He says that the English were oppressed by the insolence of the Normans and subjected to grievous outrages by the haughty governors who disregarded the king's injunctions. The chiefs of inferior rank, who had the custody of the castles, treated the natives, both gentle and simple, with the utmost scorn, and levied on them most unjust exactions. The English deeply lamented the loss of their freedom, and took secret counsel on how they might best shake off a yoke so insupportable, to which they were so little accustomed. So this is corroborated in what actually the Normans do when they've taken over England. So the overwhelming majority of English lords who aren't already dead are deposed, including Edwin and Morcar, well done idiots, and replaced with Normans or Bretons or Flemings who are loyal to William. He introduces a new land law where all land is property of the king and is only leased to people, which is still in use to this day. He also begins constructing a vast network of castles for the first time in England, as Robert Guiscard is doing at the same time in Norman territory in Italy, as a way of controlling the population and consolidate and sort of stamping out the possibility of resistance. And of course, there is legal discrimination as well. So, for example, the murderum law, where essentially if a Norman is killed and and nobody sort of steps forward to sort of take accountability for the crime, every English person, specifically English person, has to, within their community, has to pay a large sum of money as sort of restitution. So under those circumstances, it's not that surprising that resistance to William's rule breaks out pretty much immediately across various parts of England. So in the West Midlands, along the Welsh border, a local nobleman called Edric the Wild, presumably he didn't have that epithet before, leads a guerrilla campaign of resistance and is reinforced actually by large sort of contingents of Welshmen who are quite happy to get stuck in to the Normans as well. Also, there's also massive resistance in the southwest, in what's now the West Country of England, that's concentrated in the city of Exeter. So the city of Exeter refused to swear loyalty to William. They offered to pay him they're like, well, we'll pay you like the taxes that you're owed, but we will not recognize you as king. Apparently, according to some people, they were inspired to do this by Geitha Godwinson, which is if she did that, like, I get it.
Yeah.
It's not a mystery. So William has to personally ride west and direct an 18-day siege, after which the city does in fact surrender, and Geitha is allowed to leave in exile to her home country of Denmark. I wonder if that's going to be important later.
And Edith capitulates, right?
Yeah.
So Harold's sister, actually gives in to William, which I think you can't really blame her at that point, because she is actually, I think, been listed as one of the people who might have been involved in the creation of the Bayeux Tapestry. She's one of, I think, 3 women who are shown on the Bayeux Tapestry, and she's specifically shown tending to Edward on his deathbed. Either way, I think she was, a savvy person and was probably quite, didn't really see a good way out in any sense after having lost so much. And so I think in some ways she probably saw this as one of the only ways that she could secure the legacy of her family and her husband and everyone who had died, that, she could, even if it meant capitulating to William and paying him tribute, that she could still keep her family's memories alive. And no matter how much she was involved in all these histories and in the tapestry, she did live out the rest of her life in peace. She was never subjugated. Her assets were never stripped. And when she died, later on, it said that William had her body brought to Westminster so that she could be given a grand sort of state funeral. So
rebellion is kind of fomenting across England, and the most sort of troubling thing for William is that in 1086, Northumbria rebels, this time led by the dispossessed Edwin and Morcar, who have decided to throw in their lot with Edgar Atheling again. William basically sends an army north, and the rebellion pretty much immediately dissipates. What is interesting about William's policy at this point is that he's acting with an amount of restraint that I think is uncharacteristic for him. Yeah. If we think about what he's done up to this point, his preference has been for sort of grand theatrical statements of violence, and some might say terror tactics. And there does seem to be, in the first years after Hastings, a really concerted effort to be like, no, everything's normal. Everything's fine. I'm not some terrifying monster.
I'm not angry, just disappointed.
Yes, exactly. I'm not some terrifying monster who's come and taken your country from you, even though I have done that. Like, I'm a normal, nice king. I came here legitimately. Let's all play nice.
I'm your new dad. You don't have to call me dad, but me and your mother are here to stay.
Yeah.
I'm married to your mother now.
Yes. However, according to Orderic Vitalis, the English people are clearly not happy with this setup, and there are supposedly in the sort of back end of the 1060s, there are repeated sort of efforts to essentially recruit Svein Estridsson, the king of Denmark, to do a Canute, to come over and save England from the Normans. Well, because again, it makes sense if you think about it. If you think about something that if you think about the reign of Canute as something that is again just about in living memory, and something where actually England was not really fucked with that much. Canute was not interested in that. He didn't have some grand ideological project that he was prosecuting. He was interested in having a country that ran itself peacefully, and was just normal part of his empire.
Yeah.
Which William is not doing. William is provoking people. He is actively trying to replace the elite, and he is letting, as Oderic claims, letting his earls that he's appointed run sort of roughshod over the sort of traditional rights of the English people.
Yeah.
And so it's not that surprising that there are these efforts to recruit an alternative foreign king.
Yeah.
Especially one who has a pretty good military record, and the one guy who was able to beat Harald Hardrada before 1066. So in 1069, Svein sends a fleet of 240 ships, captained by his 3 sons, to England, and they sail up the Humber, and they're met with an army of Northumbrian rebels and Edgar Atheling, who had been sort of hiding out in Scotland since the Edwin and Morcar's revolt fell apart. Now, here's an interesting question that's not been resolved. Why does Edgar Atheling go along with the Svein thing? In theory, they have competing claims. Because remember, Svein has the same claim to the English throne, the same spurious claim to the English throne that Harald Hardrada had, which is that Hartha Canute gave it to them. Why does Svein and Edgar Atheling make an alliance? I have a pet theory. It's completely unsubstantiated. Would you like to hear it?
They were fucking.
No, they weren't fucking.
Damn.
If you look at the events of the 1010s, and first Svein Forkbeard's invasion of England, and then Canute's election as king, there are multiple points at which partitioning England between a Viking Northumbria and an English Wessex is a viable kind of proposition. And I do wonder, was there some kind of, however insincere it may have been, was there been some kind of understanding?
I think, probably they both had the idea of, well, we can work on this together, and then
later one of us will get vaxxed.
One of us will get vaxxed, exactly.
Off screen
But the thing about William is he never got vaxxed.
That is true. He does not seem like a guy who would get vaxxed. Then or now. The North is now in open defiance of William's authority. There's not going to be any jokes in this bit, because we're about to get real dark. The North is in open defiance of William's authority, and now there is a foreign army on England's shores ready to kind of back that up. And I would like to kind of take a step back and think about this moment, and from William's perspective, almost as a kind of repeat of what Athelstan faced. That's right, we're going way back. What Athelstan faced in the lead up to the Battle of Bramborough, which is that suddenly you have the realistic prospect of a Viking army allied with the other parts of Britain, because the Scots and the Welsh have already shown that they have no interest in William's kingship and are actively backing the rebels. Athelstan was only able to defeat the combined armies of sort of the Vikings and the Irish and the Scots through it at enormous cost by keeping England united. England is now potentially facing being split down the middle. This is a moment of supreme danger for him. It's probably the most dangerous moment he's faced since Hastings. And he has to respond to the level of the threat. That is what I think is happening in his head. So William starts marching north in the winter of 1069. And as he's approaching, the rebel army sort of dissipates. Whether this was a tactical move to kind of like, evade kind of a face-to-face confrontation, or if it was just the fact that there was kind of not as much support behind Edgar Atheling when push came to shove as, basically people were fronting up stuff they were not willing to do. We don't know. We do know that by the time that William gets to the north, the rebel army's gone. Edgar Atheling is probably safely back in Scotland. And basically the Vikings are left standing around slightly bemused. Rather than sort of face William alone with a not very big army, the Danes decide to bargain and accept a large payment of Danegeld.
Oh.
That's right, nostalgia. Remember episode 1?
Throwback.
Remember the fun we had in episode 1?
Remember how fun the Danegeld was back then?
Well, hold on to that little moment of nostalgia, because that's the last bit of fun you're going to get. So once the Danes have left, William, and I'm trying really hard not to editorialize here his own kind of what is going on in William's head at this point. What seems to have happened is that he seems to, and it's question, how calculated was this? I don't know. He clearly changes his mind about how he wants to deal with the rebels. Up to this point, he has not engaged in sort of vindictive retribution as a way to solve this. He has tried to deal with problems as they arise and govern effectively. This is not what happens in the winter of 1069. So he orders his army to split up and move across Northumbria and destroy as much of the food supply as they possibly can over the course of the winter. And this is very effective. And what it does is it creates an enormous man-made famine all across the north of England. So Orderic Vitalis, who again is probably the most balanced account that we have, given his sort of divided identity, divided loyalties. This is how he describes it. He made no effort to restrain his fury and punished the innocent with the guilty. In his anger, he commanded that all crops, herds, and food of any kind be brought together and burned to ashes, so that the whole region north of the River Humber be deprived of any source of sustenance. It's tough to calculate how many people died because of this. Contemporary sources say 100,000 people, which would have been about 5% of the entire population of England dying of famine in an entire winter, which is an unthinkably large number. As we've talked about before, the number 100,000 does kind of seem to be a stand-in in medieval writing for lots.
Modern scholars, I think, have looked at sort of records and things from that era and suggested that it might have been around 75% of the population of the North at the time.
Yeah. What is clear is that there is enormous mass death on a scale that hasn't been seen at any point in English history, in the history of Northumbria. There are enormous refugee flows into Mercia and Wessex of people just trying to find anything that they can. There are accounts of cannibalism. It is one of the... There's no real way to kind of sugarcoat this. It's often that this event is called the Harrying of the North now, and there's a bit of a debate. Is this a genocide? This is a question that people have asked. Does this amount to a genocide of, the people of the North by their nominal king? I think that's an anachronistic term, because genocide is not a word that's even in use.
It presupposes a conception of genetics, first of all.
Yes, well, exactly. And I don't think there's any kind of attempt to destroy a people's culture. But I think that if we're going to use anachronistic terminology, I think there's no other, we would have to call it a crime against humanity on a scale that won't be rivaled for a very long time. And I think the reason why we reach for genocide as the term is because it's a moral abomination. And I think it's really important that when we understand the harrying of the North in its context, we understand that the harrying of the North was also seen as a moral abomination at the time.
Yes, and over throughout history. I mean, we will give you a sense of how it was responded to by Orderic, but it's not just him that is saying these things.
No. It is agreed upon. Even the most sort of pro-Norman sources are unable to kind of really excuse it. And I think, again, you can ask the question, was this militarily necessary? I think that I have some issues even entertaining that as a question. But, was this militarily necessary? Or was this just a case of a guy who had kind of a screw loose? A guy who had been harassed his entire life by kind of questions of his legitimacy, and when he comes to the throne in England, does make a concerted effort to be seen as a legitimate king, and is not accepted by the population, and decides, to be Machiavellian about it, it's better to be feared than loved. But I think for the final word on the harrying of the North, we have to go to Orderic Vitalis, who gives this as his closing argument. My narrative has frequently had occasion to praise William. But for this act, which condemned the innocent and guilty to die by slow starvation, I cannot commend him. For when I think of helpless children, young men in the prime of life, and hoary greybeards perishing alike of hunger, I am so moved to pity that I would rather lament the grief and suffering of the wretched people than make a vain attempt to flatter the perceptions of such infamy. Moreover, I declare that assuredly such brutal slaughter cannot remain unpunished. For the Almighty Judge watches over high and low alike. He will weigh the deeds of all in an even balance, and a just avenger will punish all wrongdoing, as the eternal law makes clear to all men. After 1069, 1070, William is pretty much unquestioned as the king of England. I mean, there is still resistance. I think East Anglia in particular continues to be a real hotbed of resistance, but there's nothing like that moment in 1069 where there's this viable alternative candidate and a serious kind of effort to kind of challenge William's authority. And so a lot of the people who are not willing to accommodate themselves to the new regime flee, well, everywhere, but particularly to the other nations of the British Isles, so to what's now Scotland and Wales and Ireland, as what are essentially refugees. And some of them are sort of kept in the courts of these various kings. But if they thought that they were going to be able to escape the Normans by fleeing to Scotland and Wales and Ireland, they were badly wrong. Because now we spent so much time talking about the English state being this, for the time, ferociously organized, very, very sophisticated institution. And now what you've got is that incredibly sophisticated institution in the hands of the Normans, a bunch of people who valorize violence and violent expansion of their territory, and simply love conquering for its own sake. And now also paired with these new military technologies that the Normans have imported from France, so knights and castles. And so suddenly the English state starts to look even more, if you're standing from the perspective of Wales or Scotland or Ireland, starts to look even more predatory than it did in the Anglo-Saxon period. And lo and behold, the Normans will make various other attempts to conquer and depose the other kingdoms of the British Isles. But that is a story for our final episode, where we will talk about the Normans in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, how these societies accommodated this new force on their doorstep, how they accommodated the cultural changes that the Normans were bringing to the British Isles, and why the coming of the Normans to England specifically changed the course of history for the entirety of the British Isles, no matter what nation you belonged to, no matter what language you spoke.
So thank you so much for listening. We can't wait to wrap up this series at the next episode. It's been such a fun ride so far. Well, not always fun.
This was a bummer.
It's been such a great time doing this series. We've had some, we've been really lucky to get to record with Joe, which is always a pleasure. Even though he's not been with us, even though he's no longer with us.
Yeah, he died off screen.
Yeah.
I'm working on some necromantic spells.
He got harried.
Yeah. No, we can't make fun of it.
And if you enjoyed this episode, this series, this show in general, then we would be delighted if you gave us a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform, and on Spotify you can even leave us a comment. If you do so, then we will read a couple of them out at the next episode, just like we're about to do now. Thanks to Caitlin, who said, "It's a shame that Google didn't exist in medieval Europe, so that all these important dudes could do their own research and didn't become another jab victim." Praying emoji, vaccine emoji, cross emoji, eagle emoji, skull emoji, hashtag vaxxed.
Okay, I feel like we've all had fun here. I do need to kind of say, get fucking vaccinated. This isn't a bit. Well, that was a bit. This is not a bit. Get vaccinated.
Yeah, we're not saying that the comment wasn't a bit, but, just to make our opinions clear. Inoculate yourselves.
We've all had fun doing the hashtag vaxxed jokes. That is not the position of this podcast, for the love of Christ.
Oh, and I also wanted to shout out my friend Pauli, who messaged me and said, "Why haven't I got a shout out on the podcast yet?" I'm sorry. That was a mistake on my part. Pauli and I went to the same high school. We went to an impoverished school for underprivileged kids in Berlin, Germany. We always dreamed of a better life, and now they're a history teacher teaching the children of our future, and I'm lucky to get to make this podcast. So, yeah.
And I'd like to shout out my friend Rory, who messages me every single time we release a new episode saying, "When is this episode going to feature beans?"
Anyways, say the words.
All right. Well, until next time.
No, you have to say that's just not going to do us.
No, I said that before. We missed
Okay.
You missed the window.
Oh, okay. Never mind. And on that note, we are going to leave you for today and go make some pierogi.
Yeah. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.